Professor Baker here. We're going to be talking about Rethinking Human Nature, Chapter 4. We're going to sort of get into the discussion relating the way we understand the metaphysics of the human person with morality. What kind of moral implications do these various views hold? And I think this is a really interesting chapter by Corcoran. Again, the class is within a spiritual formation program. And so we're going to sort of talk about some of these philosophical views and how they relate to morality, in this case, Christian character and virtue, and ultimately to spiritual formation. How do we form the whole person within the Christian tradition? And I think this chapter starts to make that a little bit more obvious. Other things you've read, right, maybe less obvious, but the semester, this 8 weeks, is sort of like a journey, almost like a really large argument to say how we view the human person has really important significance for how we understand Christian morality and ethics, which has everything to do with spiritual formation and the formation of the Christian person. So chapter 4. One of the things I'm going to do now, you may have had some of this earlier, right, in earlier lectures, PowerPoints, posts, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Philosophy often can be broken into 3 separate branches. There's more than this, but there's often like 3 primary branches of philosophy. One we call epistemology, just a fancy word that means philosophy of knowledge. We talked about this in week 1 quite a bit. Argumentation, pursuing truth, criteria that helps us determine good arguments from bad arguments. We often say those criteria are truth indicative. We looked at inductive and deductive arguments, which help us get at truth and knowledge. So anytime we're pursuing those kinds of claims, we're evaluating ideas, searching for the truth, pursuing knowledge, we're in the realm of epistemology as it relates to philosophy. A second large branch of philosophy we call metaphysics. And in Corcoran's book, we've been dealing with metaphysics. Metaphysics, just right, the philosophy of ultimate reality. What is ultimate reality? Where are the ultimate foundations? Often if we talk about God, the soul, human freedom, right, meta-ethics, the origins of morality, those kinds of big picture questions are often called metaphysical questions. They often go beyond the physical, right? They're metaphysical. We've been discussing the metaphysics of the human person, right? What does it mean to be a human person? What is the ultimate reality of what it means to be human? Are we physical things only? Are we both physical and non-physical? Do we have an eternal soul that can live after death? These are big picture sort of metaphysical questions that we've been looking at, what it means to be a human person. So that's metaphysics. And then finally, the third main branch, again, there are other smaller branches like aesthetics, which is philosophy of art, political philosophy, etc., etc. 3 big branches. The third branch is ethics, right, which is the philosophy of the good. What is right or moral? How do I know that? What does it mean to have virtuous character? Right? You have these big moral kinds of questions, ethical kinds of questions, and that's the third branch of philosophy. Today's reading begins to bridge some gaps between the metaphysics of the human person and then some ethical or moral issues surrounding the human person. Value of life, abortion, stem cell research. What do we do with people that are in persistent vegetative states, right? They can't live without machines. So you have some of these moral issues. And the idea is, well, it seems like the metaphysical position we take regarding the human person will have some big ramifications for how we understand these moral issues, right? So connecting branches 2 and 3, this chapter is sort of integrating them. Metaphysics and morality, right? That's where we're at. So dualists believe that humans possess an immaterial soul, and that's where our identity lies. That's who we are fundamentally, that immaterial soul that is eternal. The soul does not die with the body, right? It lives on. Dualists often argue that the human soul comes into existence at the moment of conception. So this becomes important for some of these issues, these moral issues we're going to talk about, right? Many dualists, not all, but many dualists believe that the soul comes into existence when sperm and egg meet, that moment of conception. And this means that fetuses, and that should not have an apostrophe there, just should be ES. Thus, fetuses are full-fledged human persons from the moment of conception. The moment that soul comes into existence, I'm a full-fledged human person, morally equivalent to any other person in existence. That early embryo has the same moral status as I do, or you do, or anyone else, right? But what if we look at the human person differently, right? What difference might that make? The Constitution view, which we've been reading about with Corcoran, and other materialist views argue often that in order to be a full-fledged human person, one must be capable of certain psychological states, right? We've already talked about this. Corcoran highlights, to be a full-fledged human person, you have to have intentional states like conscious thought, desires. You have to be able to will things, intend things. And you have to be able to have a first-person perspective, to be able to think about the fact that I'm thinking, to recognize that I'm thinking about whether I'm a person or not, right? That I have this kind of first-person conscious thought or perspective. This means, though, that fetuses and those in a persistent vegetative state, PVS, are human. That is, they have the genetic material showing that they're human, but they're not persons because they don't have intentional states. For fetuses, they don't have them yet. For PVS patients, they used to have them, now they don't. They may never have them again. They don't have a first-person perspective. So the qualifications for personhood do not exist for fetuses and for PVS patients. They might not exist for others, right? It might be possible that someone with severe disabilities doesn't have a first-person perspective, doesn't really have intentional states. It might be possible that someone with severe dementia or Alzheimer's might not meet this criteria. So again, they're human, but they're not persons. And this makes a difference. In this context, right, we can talk about personhood. In this context, being a person or personhood is a philosophical term used often in moral, legal discourse, right? To be a human is to have the right genetic makeup. Fetuses have that. People hooked up to machines, PVS patients have that. But to be a person means to have certain capacities unique to humans, right? Maybe this is a soul that makes me not only human, but a full-fledged person. Maybe it's certain psychological states, intentional states in a first-person perspective and whatnot. But it's something extra, right, that we talk about what it means to be a person. Historically, the notion of personhood has been associated with a certain moral status, certain rights, certain moral considerations. So in the past, it has been that if you're not a full-fledged person, then you don't have the same moral status, the same moral rights as full-fledged persons, right? So you can be human, but one human's a full-fledged person, the other human's not a full-fledged person. They have different moral rights and a different moral status. To some extent, I think Corcoran disagrees with this, but to some extent, I think he agrees, right? That personhood is relevant for your moral status. Moral implications. And this is where we start to get into the debate surrounding this issue. And these issues are really delicate. I do not expect you to agree with Corcoran or me. I, in fact, would expect some of you to disagree. But I want you to at least hear the arguments, work hard to be open-minded, right? Really listen to what's being said, and then think through, why do I agree with those elements that I agree with? And why do I disagree with those elements that I disagree with? Can I make an argument as to why I disagree or agree? That's what I care about. Are you thinking philosophically? Are you using those concepts from the first week to make arguments, to really evaluate ideas? So the first step is to be open-minded and listen, even to those views that differ from your own, and then also to then begin to think critically about why you might agree or disagree. So again, I in no way expect that there'll be agreement on this, but I do think these arguments are interesting. Okay, so here we go. Connecting morality with the metaphysics. According to many dualists, if CV does not consider fetuses or PVS patients full-fledged persons, and CV does not. Fetuses do not have intentional states, they do not have a first-person perspective, so they are not persons. Then it is incapable, the CV position is incapable of generating moral obligations or moral expectations to protect life in its early or late stages. Thus, the metaphysics of CV leads to horrible moral implications. So many dualists, if your view suggests fetuses aren't persons, then fetuses don't have moral status, there's no moral obligation to protect them, and abortion is perfectly moral. I'm not killing a person, right? And this is the fear of many dualists, is that these materialistic views, that CV and other views sort of have these moral ramifications tied to them. Of course, then the follow-up is, well, dualists also believe that their view provides a metaphysical view capable of generating moral obligations that will protect life in its very early and very late stages. Again, many dualists believe the soul comes into existence at the point of conception, and at that point, you have a full-fledged human person, morally equivalent to you or I. Well, that metaphysical view clearly would make abortion immoral, equivalent to murder, really. But if CV holds that human fetuses are not persons, then why would it be wrong to terminate that fetus? And so this is where the metaphysics and the morality start to get mixed up with each other. Corcoran's claim, and this is important that we begin to hear what he's saying, whether we disagree or agree, we need to hear it, right? He says, look, metaphysics are not enough. You can hold the metaphysics of dualism and really value fetuses, human life, and whatnot, but you could be a dualist and not really value human life that much. Metaphysics is not enough. Similarly, Corcoran argues you can be a materialist and really be opposed to abortion and value life in all of its forms. Or you can be a materialist and be in favor of abortion and not really value human life as much in all of its forms. Similarly, he says, you can hold to a CV view and be opposed to abortion, value life in all of its stages. You can also hold the CV view and be in favor of abortion. So there's nothing about your metaphysical view that necessarily leads to the moral views that the dualist claims, or that many dualists claim. Metaphysics is not enough to trap you into one moral argument over another, right? You need more. You need to have a separate moral argument. And so the rest of the chapter, really, Corcoran tries to say, let's look at these separate moral arguments, because he's someone, and I'm someone, who holds the CV view, but I'm morally opposed to abortion, right? And I think those two things are compatible. He gives an example, right? He says, look, dualists often, especially in religious circles, are often concerned with abortion. They're often opposed to abortion. They want to say that human life starts at conception when the soul connects to the body. And he says that's great, but dualism has not always valued human life in all of its stages. In fact, dualism historically has often led to devaluing human life. For many dualists of the past, the only thing that mattered is the afterlife. This life is a very short period of time, 50 years, 70 years. My eternity is in heaven. So there's a sense in which they become so heavenly minded, their whole focus is on how do I get souls to heaven, that they don't care for the body. other people? Why do we need to feed the poor? Why do we need to care for social justice? Why do we need to have clean drinking water in Africa? Why do we need to worry about any of those things? All that really matters is where their souls go when they die. So they care so much for the soul in the afterlife and eternity that they're no earthly good, that they're not caring for those human beings dying of starvation right now. There's a devaluing of this life in favor of eternity. And dualists have, at times, held that view. You can hear the logic, and I'm sure you know Christians like that even now. And historically, I know that that's been true. Similarly, Corcoran argues, the logic of dualism might not help us so much with abortion. If who I am is wrapped up in my soul, and that's my primary focus and identity, that's what lives on after death, then killing a human body is not really killing a person. Killing a fetus is not really killing a person because their soul is not destroyed. Their soul gets to be, in fact, their soul, because they've not committed any sin, gets to be with God for eternity. So I'm not killing a person, I'm just terminating a body. Right? Similarly, if I kill an adult, I'm terminating a body, but the person is released to eternity because who they are is wrapped up in their soul. So dualism doesn't help us with these moral issues as much as dualists want to think. Similarly, materialists and those with the Constitution view, the CV, are not committed to pro-abortion stances either, or stem cell research for that matter. Those require separate moral arguments. This is a side note for me, something that I've thought about quite a bit. And that is, if the soul comes into existence at the point of conception, then certain problems arise. For instance, according to many different sources, this one comes from Opitz, right? Embryologists estimate, and there's good evidence to support this, right, that the rate of natural loss for embryos, those that have been fertilized, and have developed for 7 days, is 60%. The natural loss rate of embryos developed for 7 days is at 60%. It's higher for those that initially fertilize and then never really start to develop and just sort of flush out during the menstrual cycle. But that's a pretty high percentage that just sort of naturally do not come to fruition, do not become full-fledged fetuses and babies. But if they have souls, that's more than half that never become a full-fledged baby. Do they go to heaven? Why would God fertilize that egg or allow that egg to get fertilized, create a soul, only for it not to come to fruition? If that was a really low percentage, it might make some sense, but at such a high rate, it's just something I've been grappling with. I don't have an answer for this. But as information comes out, I begin to think about these things and begin to ask these questions like, will heaven be populated more than double those people that became full-fledged humans, right? Babies birthed. Will there be more than double that many in heaven because of all these embryos that have been fertilized but never made it? How does that work, right? Obviously, I've moved away from dualism in my own life, and so some of these issues get resolved for me, but I think these are some questions that dualism raises. So again, I don't have good answers, but I certainly have certain questions related to that. The point here is that a separate moral argument is needed. Your metaphysical position does not lock you into one moral stance with regard to abortion or euthanasia or stem cell research, right? Various metaphysical views can hold various moral positions. One other thing I'd like to note, Corcoran's goal here is not to criticize dualism. He's done that already in chapter 1. Corcoran is not a dualist, but he is not intending to criticize dualism. I'm not intending to criticize dualism. I'm not telling you that all dualists devalue life or that all dualists have this very poor view or something. That's not the goal. The goal at this point for Corcoran is to show that his Constitution view is compatible with a pro-life stance, valuing life at all of its stages. So his main goal in this chapter is to say, dualists often criticize me saying my view cannot value life at all of its stages, and I want to defend my view saying that it can. So don't lose sight of that sort of overall goal. So to do that, he's going to address those that attack him. So first, Corcoran's going to look at some of these arguments that say, if you hold a materialist view, if you hold a Constitution view, then you cannot defend life at all of its stages. You cannot care for it, and there's a moral problem there. And so he uses a book by J.P. Moreland and Scott Ray. It's called Body and Soul, right? And he extracts an argument right from there. I've condensed it a little bit, but here it is. So this is important here. Premise 1. The Constitution view argues that personhood is grounded in certain psychological states, right? Intentional states, first-person perspective. Premise 2. Fetuses and persistent vegetative state patients lack these psychological states, as do others with severe disabilities and whatnot. Therefore, fetuses and PVS patients are not persons. They're human, not persons. So far, by the way, Corcoran agrees. Premise 3, if a human organism is not a person, then that organism lacks a moral status sufficient for generating moral obligations or moral expectations to care for and protect life. The conclusion then, if these premises are true, fetuses and PVS patients lack the moral status sufficient for generating moral obligations to care for and protect their life. If fetuses are not persons, then there's not this moral obligation. So you want to look through those again. Premises, if the premises are true, the conclusion is supported, right? So that means you know that Corcoran probably disagrees with one of these premises, right? Which, right? I'll step back for a minute. Do you agree with this argument? Why or why not? We know that Corcoran disagrees, but do you agree? If you want to look at it again, right? Persons have certain psychological states. Fetuses and PVS patients don't have those, therefore they're not persons. If a human organism is not a person, then that organism lacks a moral status sufficient for generating moral obligation. Therefore, fetuses and PVS patients lack this moral status. Right? Which of the premises do you think that Corcoran criticizes and why? Right? Where's the weakness? Where do you think the controversy or the debate is? Corcoran criticizes premise 3. And here it is again, I've restated it. Corcoran does not believe that this connection holds. In fact, he thinks that Ray and Moreland fail to show the connection. That is, if something is not a person, then it does not have moral status, and we do not have a moral obligation to protect it. Right? They're trying to make this connection in premise 3. If you're not a person, then you don't need to be protected morally. But why? Why can't we have moral obligations towards human non-persons like fetuses? Why can't we have moral obligations towards non-humans like animals? Why can't we have moral obligations to those things that are not persons? Unless you can show that, then the argument falls apart because premise 3 falls apart. Can you establish that connection, that we have no moral obligation to non-persons? Right? And Corcoran thinks we do have obligation to non-persons. Therefore, we do have obligations to fetuses, to PVS patients, to those that are severely disabled, to those that may have severe dementia. Right? Even though they're not full persons, full-fledged persons, we still have moral obligations to them. And so now we have to hear that. Right? So here are some of Corcoran's arguments to say, hey, look, I can hold the Constitution view and I can care about life at all of its stages. Right? Corcoran's arguments. So premise one, fetuses are not persons, but they're persons in potentia. That is, fetuses are potential people, potential persons. If we leave them alone, many of them will become full-fledged persons. Premise two, thwarting the movement from potential to actual is immoral. This is a common premise found in many Catholic moral arguments and Orthodox Christian moral arguments, that if something has the ability to move from potential to actual, and we thwart that potential, especially if it's something that we consider part of the created order, right? Natural law in some sense. If we thwart that, what we're doing is immoral. So premise three is, well, abortion thwarts the movement from potential to actual. Fetuses are potential people. Thwarting potential to actual is immoral. Abortion thwarts that potential. Therefore, abortion is immoral. And this is one of the arguments that Corcoran gives to say I can hold the Constitution view and still be opposed to abortion. Corcoran supplements this argument with a particular Christian conviction. You can find that on page 91. There's sort of a hidden premise going on that he makes explicit later. As a Christian, Corcoran believes, God actually intends for every fetus to become a full-fledged person. God's intentional will is that every fetus become a full-fledged person. Thus, we have a moral obligation to preserve this life and this process to facilitate God's intentional will for this fetus. Christians obviously have this moral obligation, even though the fetus isn't a full-fledged person yet. The fact that God intends it to become one means we ought to preserve it. Thus, abortion should not be used as a form of birth control or out of convenience. This is not about me. If I'm a woman and I get pregnant and I don't want to have a child, this is no longer about me, especially if I'm a Christian. This is about God intending this fetus to become a full-fledged person and me not thwarting that process from potential to actual, right, as a moral criteria. Doing that makes the action immoral. But what about fetuses that do not have the potential to become persons? Like those that we know even before they're born that have severe difficulty or disability. What about PVS patients who are old often, that are in a persistent vegetative state and will never become full persons again? We're not thwarting the movement from potential to actual now. What moral criteria would we use to say that it's immoral to terminate these fetuses or these patients, right? And so Corcoran addresses this as well. He says, all fetuses, even those that will never become full persons, and all PVS patients are members of the human community. They have human genetics. Premise two, terminating fetuses and PVS patients diminishes the kind of bond essential to the preservation and health of the human community. Right? So if we terminate these fetuses and PVS patients, we're diminishing the bond of this community. Premise three, those actions that diminish this communal bond are immoral. Therefore, terminating fetuses and PVS patients is immoral because of this diminishing community, right? These bonds that it destroys. So we create sort of a separate argument to say even these fetuses and these PVS patients have value to the community and should be preserved. Corcoran supplements this second argument with a Christian conviction. So underlying this philosophical argument is also his Christianity at work, right? And there's a hidden premise, and that is all life is a gift from God. He's going to talk about the doctrine of creation. All life is a gift from God. As such, it should be treated with dignity, respect, and care. We should be good stewards of the gifts God has given. It's not that some fetuses are gifts from God. All fetuses are gifts from God. even ones that have birth defects, even ones that might not live long, right? They are gifts. They are to be cared for. They are part of God's creation, right? Once they come into existence, they're part of God's creation and should be treated with respect and stewardship, right? As such, as part of this created order. And so, as Christians, if we look at all life, all of creation as a gift, then that has certain it places moral obligations on us, how we should treat it. Even, again, PVS patients, severely disabled people, the elderly, all of that, right? And because of this, abortion and PVS patient termination should not be used as a form of birth control or just out of convenience, because the primary moral concern is not about our wants, our needs, or our convenience. The primary moral concern now is God's creation, right? This is not about how this affects me, woe is me. No, this is a gift. How do I be a good steward? How do I care, tend, and sort of care for this? If we look at premise 3 one more time from the Moreland and Ray argument, this premise here, I have my own take, which is similar to Corcoran's. My take is that the premise here creates a false dichotomy, right? The premise seems to indicate that either fetuses and PVS patients are human persons with a soul and equal moral status and moral consideration to you or I, or fetuses and PVS patients are not persons and have no value or moral status. Do you get this either or? Either fetuses are full persons because they have a soul and have equal moral status to you or I, or they're not persons and they have no moral status and no moral obligation. But why is it an either or? Why is it either equal moral status or no moral status? It seems that there are other options which would make this premise a false dichotomy. It seems that human value and moral consideration, moral status, can be thought of as a matter of degree. And maybe it should be a matter of degree, right? Rather than all or nothing. It should be more or less. I give an example of the treatment of animals. Animals are clearly not human persons. Does that mean they have no moral status and we have no obligation towards them? I don't think so. I think most of us, if we knew someone was torturing animals for fun, would say that's immoral. You're doing something harmful to this animal for no reason. That's wrong. Because we think animals, even though they're not humans and they're not persons, still have some moral status. They don't have a moral status that's equal to humans, but they have some moral status, which means it's not all or nothing, it's a matter of degree. Clearly, if we hunt animals to eat them, many people think that's okay. We're not torturing them for fun. We're not killing them for no reason. We're using them for food. Right? And this seems to be appropriate, at least to some people, morally. So, yet if I was going to kill a human and eat a human, that would be immoral. Most people would say, you're going to kill a human to eat them, that's wrong. So, animals have some moral status. We have some moral obligation to them. Do not kill them for fun. Do not torture them for entertainment. Like the Michael Vick dog fighting ring, that's wrong. Right? Torturing dogs for money or something. So they have some moral status, but they don't have equal moral status because clearly they're not equal to humans. If you've got to kill a human or an animal, you're going to kill an animal. This is what I mean by moral obligation or moral status being a matter of degree, and Corcoran agrees with me on this point. So then fetuses would fall somewhere on this scale. Not human persons, but still we have moral obligation to them. We should not terminate them out of convenience as a form of birth control because we don't want to have a child, right? But there might be some moral consideration that would say we can terminate a fetus. They wouldn't be equal to a full-fledged human person. So fetuses would fall on the sliding scale. Corcoran would suggest fetuses have more moral status, have a higher moral status, We have more moral obligation to them than we do to animals. So you have animals down here, you have fetuses up here, you have full-fledged moral humans up here. And it's this sliding scale, not an all or nothing concept. Right? So it's a matter of degree. So, what do we mean by matter of degree with regard to fetuses and abortion, or even PVS patients for that matter? Right? Does the fetus have the same moral status as the mother? No. If a woman is pregnant and the pregnancy ends up threatening the mother's life, so we have to choose the fetus or the mother. Corcoran would argue we should choose the mother. The mother is a full-fledged human person. The fetus is a potential person. Both have moral status. We have moral obligation to both, but our stronger moral obligation is to the mother. She's a full human person. Right? Therefore, if a choice needs to be made, we choose the mother. We see the sliding scale. If we have to choose between a human person and an animal, we choose the human person. The human person is a full-fledged person, a higher moral status, stronger moral obligation. Animals have some moral status, and we have some obligation to treat them well, but not the same. Again, sliding scale. I would argue that this view fits our intuitions. Now, maybe our intuitions are wrong, but I think that this view fits our intuitions better. Right? It's compatible. I'll give some examples. When a miscarriage occurs, and many of you have experienced miscarriages either personally or someone you know, maybe your wife, again, or maybe it's happened to you. Does your intuition tell you that that is the same as if you had a 1-year-old who was run over by a car? Would you grieve the same? Would it be as painful? Morally, would you consider it as bad? Right? I guess in that case, maybe they're two accidents or something, so you wouldn't consider them moral at all. But certainly our grief seems to be different. Again, if my wife was pregnant and they told me that either she was going to die or the fetus, I would say, please make sure my wife lives. That would be my response immediately. If it's one or the other, I choose my wife. And I imagine most of you would feel the same. Women, I think most of you would say, I'm going to live, especially if you have other children and a husband. You have these things to live for that would now go without a mother. If you were a man, I think you would all say, please save my wife over the fetus. Intuitionally. Now, maybe that's wrong, but I think that fits our intuition. Or imagine this. If you have an old person who's in a persistent vegetative state, hooked up to machines, and there's a choice to be made, that that person live or their young, healthy son live. Let's say there's an organ donation match, and this person in a persistent vegetative state can save the life of their son, but they will die. So we have to choose the life of the PVS patient or the life of the son. I think many of us would say, save the life of the son. The person is typically old that's on PVS. They've lived their life. They've had a full life. This young person has not. They have the quality of life of the young person is higher. So if we have to choose one life over another, we say, let the healthy younger person live. This fits our intuition, that we have moral obligation to fetuses, we have moral obligation to PVS patients, but not the same as we do to full-fledged persons, right? Do we really have the same moral obligation to a blastocyst, right? An early, not fetus, but an early embryo. Do we have the same moral obligation to an early embryo that we do to a 6-year-old, right? I don't think we feel that we do. We don't think it's the same tragedy when someone has a miscarriage versus someone losing a child, a 2 or 3-year-old. And so maybe there is something to this idea of a more or less, a matter of degree in terms of moral status and moral obligation. But there are some differences with regard to metaphysics and morality. So I don't want to paint this picture like So I don't want to paint this picture as though the two are equivalent, right? So I'm going to highlight three differences, morally speaking, with regard to dualism and the Constitution view. Dualists argue that there's an equal moral consideration given to the human embryo, the fetus, and to a human person like you or I. Once there's a soul, equal moral status, equal moral consideration. The Constitution view says both the embryo and the full-fledged human person should be considered, but not equally. And this matters, right? We're going to talk about how this might matter. But clearly, if one says there's equal moral status and the other says there's not equal moral status, that's a difference. For Corcoran's point, though, he says, yes, there's a difference, but I can still be anti-abortion, morally speaking. I can still be anti-pulling the plug on PVS patients. Difference number two. Dualists often think abortion is murder. Equal moral status means if you kill a fetus, it's the same as killing a 6-year-old. Murder. The Constitution view, because they don't consider equal moral status, would say abortion is immoral, but it's not murder. So there's a difference there. A third difference. Dualists logically have to say there are no exceptions with regard to abortion. Constitution view can make exceptions. Let me explain. If a fetus is a full-fledged human person with the same rights that you or I have, the same moral status, then if the mother's life's in danger, we can't kill the fetus. It's not the fetus's fault, right? Imagine if a mother had a 6-year-old and there's a choice, who lives, who dies. We couldn't just kill the 6-year-old, right? Because they're equal. The moral status is equal. So we can't make an exception if the fetus is a full-fledged person. Just because the mother's life's in danger, that doesn't mean we can kill the fetus. So you can't make that exception and allow abortion in that case. Similarly, in cases of rape, the fact that someone rapes a woman does not give the woman permission to kill a person. If the fetus is a person, she can't kill the fetus, can't terminate it. So you can't make an exception in the case of rape, morally speaking. This is just the logic of dualism, life and the soul beginning at conception. So you can't make those kinds of exceptions. I can't imagine where there would be an exception where abortion would be allowed, right? Maybe if the argument is both the mother and fetus will die unless the fetus is terminated, then maybe we can make an exception, right? Because if you had two full-fledged people, a mom and a 6-year-old, the choice is both die or the mother lives. The moral decision is probably the mother lives. So in the case of a fetus, it would work the same. With the Constitution view, though, we can make exceptions. Remember, we consider the fetus but not equal to the mother. Therefore, if it's one life versus another, we kill the fetus. We allow the mother to live because we have more obligation to her as a full-fledged person. So we can make an exception there. There probably would not be an exception in the case of rape, but there would be an exception if both die or one live. So we have some differences here, morally speaking, and that is important as we discuss these moral issues. If you have questions on any of this, I'd love to hear more discussion on it. Post on the discussion board, raise it. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? What about this situation? That would be really interesting. From here, Corcoran moves into talking about stem cell research, cloning, genetic engineering, those issues. I'm going to spend less time with this, but I do want to mention a few things. 3 doctrines. So as a Christian, he wants to talk about 3 doctrines he thinks are very relevant for this moral discourse. The doctrine of creation, which should lead us to see all of creation as a gift, all life as a gift. We should see ourselves as dependent on God. We would not be here without God, right? And a sense of establishing a vocation that we are not here accidentally, but intentionally. So the doctrine of creation, that we are intentionally created with a vocation, that it's a gift, and that we are dependent. These things should play a role in our attitudes as we approach moral issues. The doctrine of incarnation, or embodiment, that creation matters, God values it. Jesus embodies a human body, that God is not just separate from creation, but is concerned with this world. And then, of course, resurrection, which is that this world will be redeemed. This world will not be destroyed or cast off, but redeemed. The very body of Jesus in the resurrection is restored and redeemed. That God is not only incarnate, but that is in the business of restoring this physical stuff. Right? The eschaton is a vision of a new heaven and a new earth. Right? Through God's grace, this will be restored. He thinks these doctrines should impact, should permeate our character, our perspective as we approach moral issues. And I think that's right. I think there's something right about that. So as an example, if we think about abortion from a Christian perspective, all life is a gift. Creation, nature, the universe is a gift. So the moment that a woman gets pregnant, I'm not suggesting that God caused the woman to get pregnant. I'm not saying God wanted the woman to get pregnant. I don't think God wants 13-year-old crack-addicted girls to get pregnant, but they do. But the fact is, because of human freedom, these things happen. Women get pregnant all the time. Once the woman is pregnant, that growing embryo and fetus is a gift. It is part of the created order. Now, maybe it's not a gift, it's not going to be an actual gift to that woman, but it has the potential to be a gift to some other family. And so, as a Christian, this is not about my convenience. It's not even about the law. It's not about what's legal or illegal. It's not about whether the fetus is a person or not. As a Christian, none of those things should matter. I don't know why we get inundated with, is it legal or is it illegal? Is the fetus a full-fledged person or is the fetus not a full-fledged person? Does the fetus have a soul or not? I don't know why we get into that. The bottom line is it's now part of God's created order, and therefore it is a gift. And we have to care and be good stewards and love that which is God's, which is all of creation. And so how do I use this and turn this and give it to God so that God might, through God's grace, turn this into a redemptive thing? And obviously adoption is a wonderful way for that to occur. Or maybe it might even happen to the mother after she has the baby, and to the father, and to that family. So our whole perspective should change, but instead we have this very selfish, consumeristic, sort of egoistic view that says this is me and this is inconvenient for my life. I can't afford it. I don't have enough money. My body is going to change, and it's a very self-absorbed process. And that's not to pass judgment. I'm really self-absorbed as a person, but I don't want to be. And as a Christian, I'm trying to see the world through a Christian lens. Right? So an incarnated view says that, right, in some sense, God is involved in the created order and involved in this fetus, is present to us. And then I have to see the world that way. The resurrection says there's nothing that God can't redeem and restore. Even the cross, this horrible view of sin and human evil and selfishness, we crucify an innocent person, a holy man, a perfect human. We crucify them. But God can redeem even that if we hand it over, if we give our lives to God, even our pain, the worst moments, an unwanted pregnancy, God too can redeem even this. The same with PVS patients. They are a gift from God. Those that are disabled can teach us, can reveal God to us, that these things are, that the quality of life does not mean that they have no redemptive value, but no, we give these people, those that are suffering, to God to say, God, redeem even this. And it might not mean healing them. It might just mean healing their souls. It might be a redemptive act that they can become a gift to others. And so we can't ignore the resurrection in these moral issues, right? We see in light of the creation, we see in light of the incarnation, we see in light of the resurrection, and our moral views sort of get shaped by this, I hope. And I hope you can see how this would apply to many other moral issues as well, right? But this is not to pass judgment on those who don't do these things. This is a very uniquely Christian framework. But to say, as the church, we ought to embody this view in love, right? One of the best views of this is Jean Vanier, one of my heroes. He started large communities. They're intentional living communities where those that do not have disabilities go and live full-time in community with those that do have disabilities. These are Christian communities. But so often those that go to live in large communities will say, I learned so much more from those that were disabled. I grew so much more from living with them, moving at their pace. Seeing how dependent they were made me realize how dependent I am on God. And so they got so much out of it, and the idea is that if we go and live with those with disability, we recognize what a gift they are, and that God redeems this when we give these people back to God, and when we give our pain and ourselves back to God, it can be redeemed. This is what it means to see in light of the resurrection, and I think it's so powerful. And so Corcoran is taking this and saying, well, let's apply that to end-of-life issues. Let's apply that to abortion. Let's apply that to stem cell research. So, stem cell research, he describes that in the book. I won't go into it here. Genetic engineering, this is things like, well, can I get a child that has the right eye color, athletic ability, hair color, right? We're starting to embark on some of these things. Human cloning, can we clone ourselves to harvest organs, a blood type, to get stem cells maybe, white blood cells, blood transfusions. Cancer patients might need marrow transplants. So can we clone for those purposes? We're embarking on some of those things as a culture. PGD, which is pre-implementation genetic diagnosis. So if my wife were pregnant, we could get tests telling us if the fetus is prone to have certain serious genetic defects or diseases, and we could do this before the baby is born. What about some of these issues, right? How do we look at them? Very interesting. One of the things is to make a distinction between legal and moral issues. This is sort of a side note, but I think it's important. The fact that something is legal does not make it moral. For instance, many people think adultery is immoral, but it's not illegal. No one goes to jail. No one pays a fine. You might get beat up in divorce court or something like that, but there's no law against adultery. Many groups think premarital sex is immoral. There's no law against having premarital sex. Many people think sexual promiscuity is immoral. There's nothing illegal about being sexually promiscuous. There's lots of forms of dishonesty that we would consider immoral that are not illegal. If I lie to my wife, that's immoral, but most of the time it's not illegal. Similarly, something can be illegal but not immoral. So Corcoran gives the example, driving 70 miles an hour in certain states is illegal, but that doesn't necessarily make it immoral, right? Driving 70 miles an hour, if that's the speed limit, it's not immoral. So why would it be immoral somewhere else? It just might be illegal. So you have this distinction that we need to make. And this confusion happens in lots of moral debate. For instance, in the homosexual marriage debate, many groups want to say it's immoral, therefore it should be illegal. But you need a separate argument, right? The fact that it's immoral does not mean it should necessarily be illegal. You need a separate argument as to why it should be illegal. If you think homosexual marriage is immoral, or if you think homosexuality is immoral, therefore homosexual marriage should be illegal, and you think that simply because it's immoral, it should be illegal, then if you're consistent, you think premarital sex should be illegal, there should be laws against it, adultery should be illegal, promiscuous sex should be illegal, all forms of lying should be illegal, punishable by the law, right? Police officers to get involved and things like that. So to be right, if we want to say everything that's immoral should be illegal, then we have to be consistent across the board. If not, then a separate argument has to be given to say, well, homosexual activity might be immoral, but why should it be illegal? Lots of immoral things are not illegal, and you need a separate argument there. So this separation comes up a lot in moral discourse. Similarly, stem cell research might be legal, Corcoran argues, but it might not be moral. Genetic engineering might be legal, but it might not be moral. These are separate issues, and so he cares as a Christian about the moral issues more than about the legal issues. So one of the things that he talks about, and I'll just talk about stem cell research briefly here. One of Corcoran's problems is that in stem cell research, you get an excess of embryos. Many of the embryos for stem cell research come from in vitro fertilization or IVF. And in vitro fertilization clinics get lots more embryos than they could ever use or that they ever plan to implant into a woman. And then the excess ones are discarded. So the argument is, well, if they're going to be discarded anyway, terminated, why not use them for stem cell research that can help millions of people with diseases? Corcoran's issue is that why are we making excess embryos? Why do we have so many? As Christians, based on the doctrines of creation, incarnation, and resurrection, we ought to only generate embryos that we intend to come to full fruition, that we intend to love, care for, and respect as part of God's created order, as part of this notion of gift that's been given. We should not simply create them because it's more convenient, easier, more expedient, more affordable, and then we can just discard them. Because even though these embryos are not full human persons, they do have moral status. We do have certain moral obligations towards them as potential human persons, right? So we should only create embryos that we intend to see through to the end. And so the fact that the process includes excess human embryos makes Corcoran very uncomfortable, and frankly, it makes me uncomfortable. Stem cell research itself is fascinating and can be extremely helpful, and I think we need to find moral ways of encouraging stem cell research that fit within sort of this Christian framework. Something that Corcoran talks about and that I think is important, he contrasts the values based around gift, creaturely dependence, doctrine of creation, doctrine of incarnation, doctrine of resurrection. He contrasts that with the values that we find in the world, in our current culture, which are usually egoism, consumerism, and control. So we want what we want to be able to purchase it and have it convenient, and we want to be able to control it. And he says these virtues are opposed to Christian virtue. But why do we want to genetically engineer things? Well, we want to control the outcome. We want to make sure our children look a certain way, have certain abilities, right? Have a certain thing set up for them right from the beginning. But this means that this is about us, what we want. We're looking at children from a consumeristic standpoint. It's like going to the mall and saying, well, I want a pair of jeans with this color, this size, for this function. Well, genetic engineering, it's sort of like, well, I want a child with this eye color, this hair color, this height for this purpose, because this is what I want for them. Do you see how consumerism is seeping into this very notion of having children and child rearing? Same thing with the PGD, right? Corcoran says, I have no problem with families finding out whether their fetus and their future baby has certain defects if those tests are designed so that they can go home and prepare, right? Go home and prepare their home for the challenges that they'll face. Pray so that God might prepare their hearts about how this might be redeemed. This might be a gift, rather than seeing it as a burden. So the tests are okay, but the problem is the purpose of the test is often, if our fetus has these defects, we'll terminate it. Well, now we're shoppers. If this does not meet our expectations, well, then I won't buy that one. I'll go purchase something else. And how can we look at children this way? How can we look at creation this way? How can we look at fetuses this way? This is not a Christian way to look at it. This is not seeing in light of all as gift. This is not about saying, God, our child is yours. We give our children back to you to say, redeem us, redeem them, use them, love them. This is about control and egoism and consumerism. I think the same thing sort of about cosmetic surgery in a different vein. I apologize if any of you have had cosmetic surgery. Again, I don't want to come off overly judgmental, but I know several Christians who have gotten breast augmentation and other things. And my fear is that there's nothing illegal about what they're doing, right? Their justification is usually, I'm not hurting anybody else. This is just about me and my body. And that's fine. But again, what's going on here? We're essentially saying, what we value about ourselves is the way we look. That's what we really care about and value, and that's what we want other people to value. In many respects, with breast augmentation, it's about becoming a sexual object for others. But is that what God values? Does God value the way I look, my outside? I don't want to see myself in light of the world. I want to see myself the way God sees me, a child of God. It's about my insides. Are my insides healed? What about my gifts and abilities? Am I giving them back to God? Where do I really see my real value? And I don't think it's in the way I look, or my physical appearance, or being a sexual object. So cosmetic surgery often is about looking at ourselves the way the world sees us, but not looking at ourselves the way God sees us, not seeing ourselves in light of creation, incarnation, resurrection, but seeing ourselves in terms of my low self-esteem, the way other people view me, and whatnot. But our self-esteem should derive from God, from God's gifts, from God's graces, and not from something else. And so I think we can take this way of thinking about morality and take it into many different areas, right? Not just stem cell research or genetic engineering or things like that. I just think so often the world's values have seeped into Christianity, and we begin to see in light of them. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm doing it for me. I'm not doing it for anyone else. This is going to help a lot of people in the long run. They're just a ball of cells, right? We have this way of thinking that sort of permeates rather than maybe checking ourselves and asking ourselves whether it's Christian. These are just some thoughts, some of my own thoughts. They're open to debate. I encourage you to disagree.